This guide was made with optics under 75 USD in mind. That's what I have the most experience with, and that's what most airsofters end up buying. If you have the big bucks to buy from a real steel brand like Vortex or Aimpoint, go for it. But if you're going to leave a snarky comment about how that route is the only valid one,
get a life. Get alive!
Reflex sights are one of the best accessories you can get for an airsoft gun. A skeptic may say, why not save money and just point fire all the time or use iron sights? Well, point firing accurately requires you to know where you're going to hit, and that requires at least one preliminary shot to get an idea of where your follow-up shots are going. This means the first 1 or 2 shots you send at an enemy are likely to be warning shots that prompt them to take cover faster than you can make your follow-up shots.
Sorry! Buddy, come on!
When used correctly, a reflex sight turns those warning shots into kill shots. More enemies hit, less ammo wasted. That in turn begs another question. Why not use iron sights? Most guns come with them anyway. A reflex sight is easier to use in low light conditions, allows for faster target acquisition, and lets you shoot more accurately from awkward positions or while moving.
Oh shit, I got that.
Knowing how to zero a reflex sight is the most important part of owning one, and I'm not going to talk about it.
What?
Siege Airsoft already has an excellent video on the topic, which explains the process in a lot more depth than I have the time to. Go watch it after you've watched this video. With that out of the way, let's talk about how to use them effectively. When aiming through a reflex sight, keep both eyes open, focus your vision on the target, and then move the reticle onto the target. Your brain combines the images from both eyes into a single 3D view. For a reflex sight, this means the body of the optic will fade out of focus and you're left with a reticle floating in the air. A lot of people don't realize this, but you don't need to see through the lens to use a reflex sight. Assuming it's zeroed correctly, the front lens can be foggy, dirty, or completely covered, and you can still land hits as long as you leave your non-aiming eye open. Hell, the back lens can be less than spotless as well. As long as the reticle is at least somewhat visible, it'll be somewhat accurate. Leaving both eyes open also means better situational awareness, and you retain your depth perception, which makes a huge difference in watching the BB's flight path and adjusting your point of aim. If aiming with both eyes open feels jarring, just keep trying. It'll click eventually. It's too valuable of a skill to miss out on. With the basics out of the way, let's cover features to look for in a reflex sight. Most modern optics are battery powered, and batteries lose their charge and need to be replaced. The most important part of that is the battery type. It should be a battery that's affordable and commonly available. AA batteries may seem like an obvious choice, but the only downside is their size. The size of the optic tends to limit the size of the battery, and AA's are fairly big. You won't see a whole lot of optics that use them, and the few that do are pretty beefy. If you don't mind the chonk and really want to use AA's, go for it. Watch batteries are more commonly used. Their smaller size means the optic itself can be smaller as well, hence their popularity. The most practical option, in my opinion, is the CR2032. The overwhelming majority of optics use them, so if your battery dies and you forget to pack a spare, there's a good chance you can bum a half-dead one from somebody else. You can find them just about everywhere, and if you know where to look, you can find them for cheap. Better yet, tape a spare to the side of your gun so you'll never be without one. Just make sure to add a piece of cardboard or paper between the tape and the battery to stop it from getting covered in adhesive. The process for swapping the battery matters just as much as the battery itself. Take this RMR clone for example. Use a 2mm hex key to take the screws out. Then remove the sight from the mounting plate and there's your battery. Replace it and reverse the process. This seems simple enough, but it involves a small tool, smaller fasteners, and requires you to re-zero your optic every time you change the battery.
This is fucking annoying!
Not the sort of thing you want to be doing in the middle of an 18-hour milsim. You want something more like this Firefield Impulse. Pinch the brightness dial with one hand and twist off the cap with the other. Replace the battery and reverse the process. No tools or tiny screws involved. One of the most important aspects of reflex sights is the reticle. You're going to be seeing a lot of it, so you better make sure you like it. There's lots of different styles of reticles, and there isn't a solid answer as to what's best. That being said, I always find myself sticking with a simple dot since most other shapes clutter my view of the target and my BBs.
Now the main problem area is up here. All of this going on up here is what's causing me the most physical discomfort. It's like a visceral reaction of discontent coming from this area. This area is not good either. I hate this, but I'm mainly worried about this. This right here is my favorite thing ever. In the history of forever. I think about this every day. I think about this all night long. I stay awake, not sleeping, because I'm thinking about this.
The size of the dot itself will vary with the model, but that doesn't matter much when your targets are within 100 meters. Reticle color is mostly personal preference, but I like red the best since it contrasts well against pretty much every environment on the planet. Some optics have multiple reticles and colors to select from. It's important to note that cheaper optics with these features may not share the same point of aim across different reticles and colors. You may have to re-zero your optic if you change the reticle or the color. Even more important than the reticle is the brightness controls. Lighting conditions are affected by weather, time of day, physical structures, and artificial light sources. Stark changes in those conditions can occur in the middle of a game as well, such as when going from outdoors under a bright sunny sky into a dark building or vice versa. If your sight is too dim, you'll have a hard time picking up the reticle quickly. If it's too bright, the reticle will be blown out and you may have a hard time seeing the target.
All I see is red!
You want as much range as possible, and fine adjustment increments that are made with simple to use controls so that you can quickly adjust the brightness on the fly. This Tasco red dot is an ideal example of what to look for. It has 11 brightness settings that are adjusted on a rheostat. The dimmest setting is only slightly blown out in total darkness, and the brightest setting is only slightly blown out on a bright and sunny day. This range of brightness combined with the fast and simple controls means that I can set and reset the brightness to exactly where I need it in a matter of seconds. This Firefield Impact Mini, on the other hand, is an example of what to avoid. It only has 5 brightness settings and they're all bright as fuck. You cycle through them by pushing the power button. It only cycles up, resetting to the dimmest setting after the brightest one and shutting off entirely if you hold the button down for a few seconds. If you want to drop the brightness, you have to remember which setting was too bright, go all the way up, and then start over from the bottom. Really annoying when the best way to set brightness is to increase it one setting at a time, and then decrease it by one when the reticle starts to blow out. The front lens of a reflex sight needs to be covered in a reflective coating in order to make the dot visible. This coating can add a tint to the lens which can impair your vision through it. Less tint is obviously better than more, but the color of the tint can vary, and I personally find blue tint to be the least annoying. The sight picture of a reflex sight matters just as much as it does for iron sights. Too much visual clutter can be distracting when aiming with both eyes open. You generally want a wide field of view through the lens and a slim housing. This SRO clone is an example of a very good sight picture. A wide field of view and a slim housing that practically disappears when your eyes focus on the target and you're left with a dot floating in the air. Take this True Glow sight as an example of a bad sight picture. The field of view is pretty narrow and the housing around it is bulky. When your focus shifts to the target, you get a dot in the middle of a blob that not only clutters your vision, but also looks like
Ding, 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 ding! Get out of my brain!
You can get away with a poor field of view if the housing is slim enough. The Firefield Impact Mini is a good example of this. The lens is tiny, but the housing is slim enough to fade away when your eye focuses on the target. Ideal optic height is going to change depending on the type of gun it's being attached to. In order to figure that out, there's some terms we need to cover. First is height over bore. That's the vertical distance between the bore axis and the optic's line of sight. Then there's the vertical distance between the optic's line of sight and the top of the surface you rest your face against to get a cheek or chin weld. There's no official term for this, but we'll call it height over weld. Height over bore should be minimized as much as possible. The more height over bore you have, the more of your body you have to expose when peeking over cover, and the more likely you are to shoot with your sight on target before the muzzle has cleared the cover. Good height over weld is more subjective. Lower height over weld means less height over bore, but if it's too low, then getting a clear sight picture is slow or awkward. Taller height over weld makes aiming faster at the cost of extra height over bore, and too much could make it impossible to touch your head against the stock while also looking through the sight. The key is to find the sweet spot between too high and too low. This is going to vary quite a bit depending on platform, personal preference, and the type of face protection you wear. Here's an AR. The bore axis, the cheek weld, and the rail are all pretty close together. I could use a very low-sitting optic to minimize the height over bore, but aiming through it correctly would be awkward. This is where risers come in handy. I could use a universal riser like this one, but it's bulky and it looks kinda goofy. Instead, I can use a different optic with a high-profile mount to achieve the same result with a smaller footprint. Keep an eye out for optics like this one that use dedicated mounts with different height options. If I want a taller setup for a little more speed, I could switch back to the short optic and put it on a carry handle with a rail adapter. It comes at the cost of more height over bore, but it's manageable. If I put the tall optic on, it's just ridiculous. Now let's try doing the same thing with another platform, the MP5. The dropped stock means there's more distance between the comb and the rail, so I can use the low optic from before and get around the same height over weld as the tall optic had on the AR. If I use the tall optic on the MP5, that's right on the verge of being too tall, but boy is it quick.
Hit! Nice trade.
I can't really talk about optic height without mentioning co-witnessing. Co-witnessing is when you have your optic at the right height for your iron sights to be visible through the optic. The idea is that this will help you find the reticle a bit faster and be able to fall back on the irons in case the optic stops working or the battery dies. There's absolute co-witness and lower 1/3 co-witness. Both have their pros and cons, so deciding which one is better is a matter of personal preference. That's all for now. Stay tuned for part 2.